Hello, and today we're going to be working with ionic compounds. We have 8 different ionic compounds we'll be working with. We'll be setting up our first 4: barium chloride, calcium chloride, copper sulfate, and iron 2 sulfate, and reacting them, all 4 of those, with sodium sulfate, sodium hydroxide, magnesium sulfate, and potassium hydroxide. Some of these reactions should produce what we call a precipitate, and then we're going to use our flame to do a flame test to see what is left in the liquid and help us identify what that precipitate is. So let's go ahead and get our well plate and get rolling with this. So we're going to begin by taking each one of our compounds and placing them in 4 of our wells going across our well plate. So I'm going to begin with barium chloride. I'm going to fill up about 1/3 of the way up on my well plate in each slot. So slot 1, slot 2, and we'll speed up so we can see each one filled up. So now we're going to take each one of our testing solutions, starting with sodium sulfate, and react it and add it into our wells, going down each of the columns and seeing how they react. So we're going to start with sodium sulfate. First one's going to be sodium sulfate reacting with barium chloride. So we'll bring that in as close as we can. We'll drop a few drops in, and hopefully you can see it made a white cloudy substance in that one. So then we're going to continue with sodium sulfate going down. So now we're reacting it with calcium chloride. As we continue down, our next one's going to be sodium sulfate with copper sulfate. And then finally, sodium sulfate reacting with iron sulfate. So some of them you can see we get a cloudy precipitate, others of them not as much. And now we'll move on to our next substance, which is sodium hydroxide. So sodium hydroxide with our barium chloride first. You can see that white cloudy precipitate forming. Then next we'll do sodium hydroxide with our calcium chloride. You can see that white cloudy starting to form. Then we do sodium hydroxide with copper sulfate. You can see a blue cloudy substance forming. And then finally sodium hydroxide with our iron sulfate. You can see kind of a green cloudy substance forming. Third test solutions are magnesium sulfate. First one's going to be magnesium sulfate with barium chloride. You can see a white cloudy substance again. Then we do magnesium sulfate, this time with our calcium chloride. Then our magnesium sulfate with our copper sulfate. See, no color change in that one. And then finally our magnesium sulfate with our iron sulfate. See, no change on that one as well. Our final test solution is potassium hydroxide. We'll do the potassium hydroxide first with barium chloride. See a cloudy precipitate starting to form. Then potassium hydroxide with calcium chloride. You can see a white cloudy substance forming as we drop it in. Then our potassium hydroxide with our copper sulfate. See a dark blue cloudy substance precipitate forming. And finally our potassium hydroxide with our iron sulfate. You can see another dark, almost greenish appearance in our precipitate form. So that was our testing with our test solutions. Next we're going to take our precipitates we formed, and we're going to do a flame test to help us identify what's left in the solution, and then using that to identify what precipitated out. Thank you. So for this test, we're going to use solutions we just created, and we're going to put them in a Bunsen burner flame and see what color flames produce from the solution. So we're going to be using the solution, not the precipitate, and figuring out what substance is in that precipitate. So the first one is our barium chloride sodium sulfate, where we reacted those two together. We put it in our flame, and you should see that bright orange color. That bright orange color is a good sign that we had sodium produced. So that's the first one. Next we'll do our test of our barium chloride again, and this time we'll do barium chloride with sodium sulfate. With sodium hydroxide. So we have a nice bright orange sodium color again on that flame. Next one's going to be barium chloride with the magnesium sulfate. So barium chloride with magnesium sulfate. You can see in this case we're getting a different color. We're not getting that bright orange we saw before. We're getting a kind of a lighter yellowish color. I'll do that one again so we can see it. Kind of lighter yellow purple. It's orange to purple color almost appearance. And then our last barium chloride one is barium chloride with potassium hydroxide. And you can see a kind of purple, almost orange flame in that case. So that was barium chloride with potassium hydroxide. Next we'll do our calcium chlorides. So first one is calcium chloride with sodium sulfate. This one we didn't really have a precipitate, so it's going to be bright orange color we have in this one. Next test is going to be calcium chloride with sodium hydroxide. This one we did have a nice precipitate form. You can see we get a nice soured orange flame. And we'll do that one more time for you. That orange flame. Then we do our calcium chloride with magnesium sulfate. Again, this one didn't really have a precipitate form, so we'll see what we get in that one. So we get like a purplish color with some orange. Finally, we have our calcium chloride with our potassium hydroxide. This one we got a nice white precipitate, and we'll get like a reddish orange, almost purplish orange flame in that one. Next we'll move on to our copper sulfate. First one's with sodium sulfate. Again, no real precipitate forming, but we get a nice orange colored flame on that one. Second one did have a precipitate. This is our copper sulfate with our sodium hydroxide. And that gives us a nice orange flame when we do that. So that was our copper chloride with copper sulfate with magnesium sulfate with sodium hydroxide. Next one is copper sulfate with magnesium sulfate. Again, no precipitate forming in this one, so we'll see what happens. And we'll put it in the flame. We can see that green color forming. We can see that green flame. Finally, we have copper sulfate with potassium hydroxide. In this one, we did have a solid blue precipitate forming. And when we put it in the flame, we get kind of that orangish purple that we've seen before. So that was copper sulfate with potassium hydroxide. Our final one is iron sulfate. First iron sulfate with sodium sulfate. Again, no real precipitate forming, but we'll see what color flame we get. We get a nice soured orange flame on that one. Then we had iron sulfate with sodium hydroxide. It had that cloudy green, kind of algae looking appearance, and that gives us kind of have an orangish purple flame coming out. We'll do that one more time just so you can see it. So a little orange, a darker orange to almost a purple color, but mostly orange. Then we have copper sulfate with magnesium sulfate. Again, this one didn't have much of a precipitate, so no real reaction forming, but we'll see what color we get. So we don't get much flame on that one. And our final one is iron sulfate with potassium hydroxide. Again, gave us kind of a green algae looking, kind of like you didn't clean your pool all winter, precipitate. And we put that in the flame, and we get that orange, that purple orange flame, that kind of purple orange flame that we've seen a few times. So that was our flame test using the ionic compounds reactive. So we used ionic compounds and we reacted them, and then we used the flame test to figure out what metal was in the solution left behind. Using that information, then you should be able to determine what the precipitate is from what did not present itself in that flame test. So hopefully this helps you complete this ionic compound precipitate lab and identify what precipitates formed in these reactions. Thank you and have a great day.